Appreciate your involvement, being here and listening in, and particularly after 2 weeks of the IVA meetings for the previous 2 weeks. We thank the BSG co-chairs, Dave Garcelis and Michael Proctor, for their continued efforts and leadership with all the BSG activities. As you remember, we took a couple of months off in the summertime to give committee members time to conduct their field work on bears in North America and around the globe. And I'd like to remind everybody that if you would please mute your sound. It sounds like we've got a beast on the webinar here. I'm not sure what beast that is, but something is making noise. So make sure you're all muted. Reminder that our webinar will be recorded and it will be available online afterwards if you want to watch it again or refer people to it. And that link will be sent out to everybody so that you've got it again. We also want to remind you that we have 3 articles from the North American Bear Expert Team in the latest International Bear News, and you've probably all seen those. And we have 3 additional articles that are all written and will be submitted to International Bear News for the next issue. Keep an eye out for that. Those articles are by Kate Kendall, Rich Bousselet, and Andrea Morehouse. So we're doing really well for producing material for the news. So let's get started on the webinar. I want to remind everybody to be sure to mute yourself, except for Heather, and to save questions until the end, so that if you want to type questions into the chat function at the lower part of your screen, webinar, we will then go through those and try to get as many as possible. And so today's webinar is the influence of human development on North American black bear behavior and demography and strategies for reducing human bear conflicts. So Heather, please take it away.
Okay, awesome. Rich, I'm not sure. There's something I think with your microphone. It kind of feels like there's a beast in the background growling. Yeah, there we go. Something's going on with your microphone. Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, let me share my screen here. Okay, so I hope you guys can see that. If you can't, give me a shout, but otherwise I'll go ahead and launch here. So I'm Heather Johnson. I work for the USGS Alaska Science Center, but I'm going to talk today about work that I did for Colorado Parks and Wildlife when I was working for that state wildlife agency. And I'm going to use the term "we" a lot today, and so I want to right up front acknowledge the we. This is a huge team effort to collect all the data and analyze the data that I'm going to talk to you guys about today. And as a study that was funded by Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the USDA National Research Center primarily, and then it was also a big collaboration with the city of Durango and Colorado State University. And there's
we can't see the screen. Are you sharing your screen, your PowerPoint? We cannot see that.
Yeah, it says I am. Thank you for letting me know. Oh, okay. Can you see that?
There it is. Okay, now we see it.
Oh, good. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah, key players in this that I want to make sure I acknowledge today are Stuart Breck, Dave Lewis, Lyle Wilmarth, Jared Laufenberg, Stacy Lishka, Joey Medina, and Rebecca Kirby. And then so many other names that you see of folks that were associated with this project, including Carl Lackey, who's on the call today. Okay, so this project was motivated by big increases that were happening in Colorado in terms of bear-human conflicts and interactions. And, Colorado, like lots of states, had just seen these conflict numbers dramatically increase to the point that all the wildlife officers were doing in the summer was dealing with bear conflicts, largely, to the exclusion of everything else. And the state had spent, in some years, in some towns, hundreds of thousands of dollars just trying to manage and kind of crisis deal with bear conflicts. So the State Wildlife Agency really wanted to understand what was driving this increase in conflicts. Was it because bears were changing their behavior, and bears using human food and really changing how they're interacting with human development, whether that was driving conflicts, or whether there were simply more bears, like whether this was a numerical issue. We had so many bears and that was really driving this increase in conflicts, and or potentially both of these factors. And ultimately, the agency needs to know what they should do about it, because depending on what the mechanism is driving conflicts, you could see that the solution could be really different, whether you focus on strategies that would change bear behavior, or those kind of numerical strategies like harvest that would change abundance. So the research objectives I want to talk about today with you are, we wanted to determine the influence of human development on bear behavior and population dynamics. We wanted to test the effectiveness of wide-scale residential bear proofing to reduce bear-human conflicts. And we wanted to assess public attitudes and behaviors related to bears, bear management, and bear-human interactions. And we did this within really considering this to be a social ecological system, recognizing that if you want to understand what's driving bear-human conflicts, you have to understand and study the bear side of things, but you also have to study the human side of things. And only with understanding kind of both sides of the coin could we really get at this issue. We did this study, we chose to do the study in Durango, Colorado. Durango sits in the far southwest part of the state of Colorado. And we chose Durango because it was a place that had lots of interactions between bears and people. The map I have there, that's during our 6-year study, those were the conflicts and interactions that either we observed or that were reported to our agency. So, this is a place where people interact with bears. And Durango sits in this valley that's surrounded by great bear habitat on all sides, really. And it's a landscape that's been changing. So city limits, that last map I showed you was kind of the core kind of in city limits part of Durango. That's in that green blob there in the middle. Durango kind of sits dead center in the middle of La Plata County. The orange polygons on the map here are outside city limit development. These were parcels that were developed, human development, residential development, back in the 70s. This is what the county looked like in 1990. This is roughly what it looks like today. So you have this landscape that, has been experiencing, lots of growth over recent decades. With all these developments comes lots of human food. And then, you have this critter, this, kind of the ultimate terrestrial food finding machine, that you stick on this landscape, right? What does this mean for both people and bears? The level of growth that was happening in La Plata County was unremarkable compared to growth happening elsewhere in Colorado. So pretty much, I don't know if you can see my cursor there, but everything pretty much here west is bear habitat in Colorado. And this is La Plata County down here. The growth that we're seeing in La Plata County is unremarkable. It's, this is happening across the state of Colorado throughout bear habitat. So, what does this mean for bears and people? Okay, so first I want to talk about the influence of human development on bear behavior. So to collect data on bear behavior, we did a lot of trapping. Just shy of 5,900 trap nights, putting traps in almost 300 different locations, working with a ton of private landowners, city, county, state, and federal landowners. In total, we conducted just shy of 1,000 bear captures, marked about 430 different bears. And our goal with all this trapping was to collar adult females. We know adult females, that's kind of key for understanding what's happening with bear populations. Adult female survival is the vital rate that's most important for bear population growth rates. And by just collaring, this 1/6 in the stage class, then we could get data on their productivity by tracking them to their dens. And then by tracking these females consecutive years, we could get data on cub survival. So we got lots of really good demographic data by just tracking adult female bears. Our goal was always to have 40 females collared per year. And then in total, what that meant, we collared 83 different females and monitored them for 235 bear years. And we tracked those females to their dens to get the reproductive data from about 190 dens. All the collars that we put out on females collected hourly GPS fixes. And so we got a ton of information about how bears were using the landscape. This is just from one bear one summer, her hourly fixes, and they see, you know, we get this great data on both how bears are using natural habitat and then how they're also using human development. As you can see, kind of Durango down there in the, you know, kind of the lower part of the screen, and this is a bear that, you know, uses both natural habitat and human development. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how bears select for human development, and throughout this talk, I'm going to talk about human development in terms of, you know, bears going to development to get human food resources. And we knew this to be true. You know, we know bears go to human development for food. We had our collaborators on this project, Dave Lewis and Stuart Breck, had done backtracking studies in Aspen and found that bears within development were predominantly eating human food sources. And then with our data, you know, we found from stable isotopes, from taking bear hair samples, we found that those bears that spent more time within human development had enriched carbon-13 levels, which means that's a signature for eating more human processed foods like corn and cane syrup. So, you know, so this is, I'm going to talk about, you know, human development, you know, being the source of human food for bears. And I just wanted to upfront kind of demonstrate that this assumption holds, that bears, you know, using development are consuming, you know, more human foods. Okay, so how are bears selecting for human development, especially, you know, as they're foraging? Well, we used all this GPS data with resource selection models and found that bears really increased their selection for human development during poor natural food years and during hyperphagia. And here on the y-axis, I've got the probability of selection for different levels of human development. And the big thing to notice here is I'm showing you the response during poor natural food years, which is the warm colors, and good natural food years, and the cool colors. And, you know, when you have these poor natural food years, we see this huge increase in how bears are selecting. You know, selecting really strongly for human development, and that selection increases across the summer as you get to the hyperphagia stage. Conversely, good natural food years, bears reduce their selection for development, and it decreases over the summer as those mass foods become available. So what this means is that when natural foods were good in our system, bears were selecting for human development, you know, not very much. So here, you know, the red colors are areas bears are selecting strongly for. When there's good natural foods, bears don't really want to be around human development. They avoided it. But when we had poor natural food years, selection really dramatically switched. And all of a sudden, you know, bears were strongly selecting for human development, seeking out those human food resources. So, you know, this implies this forage risk trade-off. Bears didn't select for human foods in all years. You know, we found that bears in our system, they all knew about human food. I mean, it's amazing to see these GPS tracks of bears just beelining 20 miles as the crow flies if needed, if they decide like, oh, time, I'm ready, I'm ready for that subsidy. You know, they just go. They all knew about it, but they on average, you know, when you look at across the population, the average population level response is that they didn't want to use that food source unless they needed it. So, you know, bears are definitely perceiving that human development's risky, and it's only really worth going to, for the most part, when, you know, you just don't have foods in the forest, food sources in town, and you know, that forage benefit is really worth it, you know, tipping the balance. So that's a population kind of average response that we measured, but I also want to acknowledge that there's lots of individual variation in responses. As we all know, bears are different and behave differently. This came from a paper that we looked at responses in Aspen, Colorado, Durango, and Tahoe, Nevada, collaborating with Carl and John Beckman. But what I want to point out here is the the gray triangles are individual selection coefficients for bears in Durango. And, you just see lots of variation. Bear selecting, development, avoiding it. And I'm going to come back to this, where I'm going to capitalize on this variation here later on. The last thing I want to talk about with this in terms of what we found in terms of bear behavior for this kind of foraging behavior was that they increased their use of development as they aged, suggesting that conflicts will likely increase as bears gain more experience with development. So they learn about this food source, they learn it's a subsidy, and they're probably more likely to use it in the future. Okay, so we saw, strong responses in how bears were foraging based on human development. How does this use influence hibernation? Because the bears are hibernating, they're not interacting with people, causing conflicts. As I mentioned, we had all this data on dens, going to dens to look at this question. And we had dens, I should say, we had dens over 11,000 feet in the La Plata Mountains, and we had dens that were down, at below 6,000 feet out in kind of desert pinyon juniper country. So we had just a lot of variation within years and across years to look at this question of hibernation. So we modeled factors associated with the start, end, and the duration of hibernation. We were looking at how the percent overlap a bear had with human development, how much, their home range comprised human development, and as a proxy for their use of human foods. We wanted to know how that really influenced hibernation, but also in the context of looking at all these other covariates. And here's what we found. These are selection coefficients, and what we found was that bears that had greater use of human development, they reduced their duration hibernating. They reduced their time hibernating. Basically, they took advantage of that food resource. They didn't hibernate as long because they had foods available to them. And interesting, if you look right above there to natural foods, it was that human food use and natural food use was a super similar response. Bears were responding to natural foods and these anthropogenic foods really similarly. When they have access to good natural foods, they stay up longer, they reduce their time hibernating. Same thing if they use human development as a food source, they stay up longer, reduce their time hibernating. Interestingly, I also want to point out this relationship with temperature, because it was really strong that bears that were hibernating in areas that were warmer, when the temperature was warmer, they also reduced their time hibernating. So for every 1 degree Celsius increase in the winter minimum temperature, bears reduced their hibernation by 6 days. And for every 10% increase in the spatial overlap a bear had with human development, in terms of their summer home range, their hibernation decreased by 3 days. So we had lots of bears in our system that, they overlapped human development, 40, 50, 60% of their range with human development. So based on our models, that implies that those bears are hibernating, a couple weeks less than bears that are, using no development, which means they're up, more time to interact with people, cause more interactions, conflicts, things like that. Okay, so we see that human development is strongly influencing bear behavior, both in terms of how they forage, their hibernation. What does this use of development, what does this mean for bear demography? We have lots of studies, GPS collars are so great for getting lots of data on how bears behave, but we don't, it's so much harder to collect this data on demography to really understand how bears are responding in terms of their demographic change to increasing development on landscapes. So I'm going to do this quick. If you guys saw my IBA talk, this is what I talked about there. I'm going to kind of condense this because I don't want to be repetitive for folks. But generally, at least in Colorado, folks see bears, when they see bears around town, they're big, they're fat, they have lots of cubs. There's a strong public perception that human foods are increasing bear population. That's reflected in the public. It's reflected, it's been reflected a lot in the agencies. At the same time, we know that bear research has shown that there's a lot of bear mortality that happens around town. So, understand this question of, do these urban areas, these human developed areas, do these serve as a, as a way to increase bear populations, or are they reducing bear populations? And this is pretty important to understand, especially as our landscapes become more developed and bears are increasing their use of those landscapes. So for these analyses, we defined bear use of development as the proportion of time they spent within 100 meters of a human structure across the summer. And for each bear, we calculated, their use of development for that year. And then we looked to see, how does bear use of development, how does that influence their body fat, their cub productivity, the survival of their cubs, and their survival, adult survival. And what we found is that use of development had really mixed effects on bears' fitness rate. We found that as bears increased their use of development, their body fat increased. It's a 10% increase in time spent within development was associated with about a 1.5% increase in bear body fat the following winter. We found that greater use of development increased cub productivity. So when bears used no development, they were predicted to have twins. But as they increased their use of development, they had a greater probability of having triplets. And by the time bears spent about 45% of their time or more around development, they were most likely to have triplets. But as bears spent more time around development, their survival of their cubs declined. So a 10% increase in time spent in development was associated with a 5% annual decline in cub survival. And the same 10% increase in time spent in development was associated with a 3% decline in adult female survival. And so for bears that are spending 20, 30, 40, 50% of their time around human development, we see a significant decline in their annual survival rates. So, we have these mixed effects, but when we want to, what are the collective effects on population growth? So to get at that question, we developed a population matrix model. It was female-based and parameterized totally from our field data, with the exception of yearling and 2-year-old survival. We pulled those estimates from the literature, but everything else we could parameterize from our field data. And what we found is that as their use of development was projected to increase, the population growth rate was projected to decline. So our population, the growth rate was right around 1 when food conditions were average and bears were projected to use no development. But as, if you had years with poor natural food conditions, or as bears increased their use of development, those things additively reduced the population. And so it, quickly declined below 1 and was decreasing. So, yes, you have bears around town. They are big, they're fat, they have more cubs, but they do die at higher rates. And that, it's a net population decline still. That benefit of increased reproduction did not outweigh the cost of higher mortality. And importantly, our projection models corroborated a mark recapture study we did with genetic data. So at the same time that we're collecting on the fine scale collaring data, we also did a big abundance project for 4 years. Jared Laufenberg was a postdoc working with me, and he developed these integrated spatial capture-recapture models where he integrated both the genetic data and the telemetry data to estimate bear abundance and density. And this is what he found in terms of abundance. And this was just done over the first 4 years of our study, but he estimated this big population decline that coincided with the natural food shortage. So this is what natural foods look like. So while we're doing all this, we did mass surveys to look at how things like gamble-oak and chokecherry and crabapple, surfaceberry, and other key mass species, how they varied each year. And what you see is, in 2012, kind of the bottom drops out. I mean, there's just like no food estimated for pretty much any masting species. And then coinciding with that, we get this this 57% decline in adult female, or sorry, not, it's just female bear abundance. And that's coinciding with a year like this, that bears are selecting strongly for development, human foods as a source of subsidy, and then dying at higher rates. So this was black bear mortalities found within the study area, not collared, but just any bear that was known to die within the study area. And you see 2012, that's National Food Failure Year, you just have this huge spike in mortality. There's a little bit more harvest, but a lot of it is coming from greater numbers of vehicle kills, management removals, and just other accidents. Okay, and then I want to show you too how the footprint of human development really changes and influences bear density on the landscape. So this plot here just shows you where residential development is within the system. So all the black there is just where you have people's houses and things. And this is how bear density was predicted to change before and after this food failure. So you have the crosshairs are bear mortalities that year. And what you see is that, after the food failure, there's just kind of this like emptying out of bears around human development that's associated with this big increase in mortality. I hope that's not my computer buzzing at me that I don't know. Okay, so how did conflicts change after the population decline? We have a 57% decline in the female abundance. Do we see a decline in conflict? So here's our, again, abundance plot. Here was the trend in conflicts. These were calls that came into Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And so, you see this massive increase during the food failure year, and then they decline, but they're similar and slightly higher, if you look at the numbers, than they were prior to the population decline. So, we don't see that conflicts correlate with abundance, and at least in these 4 years. Okay, so human development has big influences on bear behavior, big influences on bear demography. What strategies can we use to reduce bears coming into town for human subsidies, reduce the demographic impacts? Well, we wanted to really look at this, the effectiveness of wide-scale residential bear proofing. This is not rocket science, right? And this Parks and Wildlife was pushing cities to use bear-resistant containers. But there wasn't a ton in the literature of how effective this was. There's a lot about national parks, right? We have like amazing literature in national parks. If you put in trash cans and you do this enforcement, like you can really reduce conflict. Great data in national parks, places where you have a lot of control over people. But there wasn't a lot of good data on, out in the world when you don't have that level of control, how effective is this? And it's so expensive to do all this bear proofing. We felt like we needed to really have evidence to convince Colorado municipalities to take this on. So we did this giant bear proofing experiment. We divided up the city into 2 treatment areas and 2 control areas. We collected pre-treatment data in 2011 and 12, and then we deployed over 1,100 bear-resistant trash containers into our control areas. The red areas there on the map. And then we collected 4 years of post-treatment data. So this is Lyle and I getting ready, to deploy over 1,000 bear trash cans, putting on our little stickers, explaining the study to folks. Yeah, this was a huge, huge effort. Doing this was so much harder than capturing almost 1,000 bears. Trying to work with the city and get, this to come together for people to deal with people's how they pay for their trash cans, all this stuff. This was the hardest thing. And we collected 3 types of data on this. We had a technician driving around at 5 in the morning to look at conflicts, like where we saw bears getting into trash, these trash conflicts. We collected data on people's compliance with the wildlife ordinance. So Durango had a wildlife ordinance that said you have to have your trash secure from bears until 6 a.m. on the morning your trash gets picked up. So otherwise your cans have to be locked or they have to be put in your garage or something, cannot be available. So again, we had technicians driving around at 5 in the morning, spying on people, seeing whether they locked their cans and had them secure. And then we did public mail surveys. Before we did the put the cans out, and then right after we put out the cans in 2014, and then a couple years later. And this is what the kind of the hot spots of conflict looked like during our pre-treatment years. You know, for whatever reason, our control area, what would turn out to be our control area, had a lot of conflicts during our pre-treatment, but they are distributed pretty well across our southern treatment and control. And here's what it looked like post-treatment, you know, after putting out those bear cans. In our northern units, we reduced conflicts a bit in some of our hot spots in the treatments, and surprisingly, it also dissipated in our control area, which is a little, not expected. But we see this really strong response in the southern treatment and control, where those conflicts really get pushed down from the treatment into the control. During our post-treatment years, trash conflicts were 60% lower in the treatment areas with bear cans than in the control areas, and compliance with the wildlife ordinance was about 40% higher. Now, 40%, only 40%, like this was frustrating to me, because I thought if you gave someone a free $250 bear can, I thought they'd use it. And this is where I was really wrong. You know, Stacy Lishka, the human dimensions person I was working with, she said, "Oh no, we have to measure if people actually use their bear cans." And I was like, well, of course they're going to use their bear cans. Like, we're giving them free $250 can. Like, of course they're going to use it. And she said, "Oh no, you know, we're going to have to measure that." And sure enough, only about 60% of people actually would use the dang things right and lock them. And compliance turned out to be key. So, you know, that human behavior of locking the cans was key. So here on the y-axis, this is the probability during our weekly morning of trash pickup survey of your house, whether we saw a bear conflict during our 10 weeks, based on how many people, the proportion of people in your neighborhood that complied with wildlife ordinance. I just realized if my cursor's been doing something weird, it's scrolling on a different screen. Sorry about that. Okay. So what we found is if about 60% of your neighbors are locking up their trash, they're complying with the ordinance, your probability of conflict really declines significantly, such that within our study area, if only 10% of the people complied with the ordinance, our model suggested that we'd have about 272 trash conflicts. But if 80% of people are complying with the ordinance locking the trash, now that goes down to 45 conflicts. And what was cool about this was that it aligned really closely with a theoretical paper, kind of a thought experiment paper that Sharon Brock-Murdo and colleagues have published, where they try to figure out, using estimates from the literature, like how much trash do you have to lock up before it's not worth it for bears, if you have that forage risk trade-off, where it's not worth it for bears to forage around human development. And they found that about 55% of folks lock up their trash in urban areas and 70% on the urban interface. You know, that's the tipping point. And you know, with our empirical data, we found that 60% was the tipping point. So right in that window. Then Stacy looked at what factors were associated with compliance. You know, what factors are associated with whether or not you'll lock your can. Not surprising. She found that if you have a lot of bear conflict in your neighborhood, you're more likely to lock your can. But this was interesting. She found that people that trusted Colorado Parks and Wildlife more had more trust in their agency, and people that saw really perceived more benefits of bears, they were less likely to lock their cans, which is not what we expected. You know, it was a really significant result. And so now Stacy and our colleagues are really interested in testing different messaging. You know, if you really want to help Parks and Wildlife, you know, lock your can, or, you know, if you really want bears in the system, you know, this is what you can do to help bears. You know, if you change messaging, understanding what motivates people, what motivates human behavior, can you influence, you know, changing human behavior? So that's what we're really interested in understanding next. And with this big bear proofing experiment, what we found was that it not only had ecological benefits in terms of reducing conflicts, but it also really increased public opinion. And so there are big social benefits. So people that got the bear cans, they show that they were much more satisfied with CPW's management after, you know, during those post-treatment years. The folks that got the bear cans had a lot greater support for wildlife ordinances and, feeling that there should be wildlife ordinances. And what was interesting is everyone thought, in the post-treatment years, everyone was more supportive of ordinances because, in Durango, this wasn't a secret that half the town got bear cans. It was not a secret. So everyone was more supportive of these kind of, ordinances and these bear cans, but people who got the cans were particularly supportive. And the folks that didn't get the cans, they showed that they have a greater perception of their risk in terms of having future conflict. So putting out these cans was a win-win from an ecological standpoint and from a social standpoint. Okay, so to summarize here, why are human bear conflicts increasing? Is it because bears are changing their behavior? Based on findings from our study, we found empirical evidence to suggest that yes, bears are increasing their use of development as they learn to use human foods for subsidy, especially during poor natural food years. We found that the duration of bear hibernation is decreasing with greater use of human foods and warmer temperatures. And given expanding human development and reduced hibernation and changing climate conditions that are expected to cause more frequent food failures in the Colorado Rockies, that we should expect to see more conflicts in the future based on these changes in behavior. Okay, are conflicts increasing because we have more bears? In our study system, no, we don't have evidence to see that. Bear use of development had mixed effects in vital rates, but a net negative effect on population growth. We saw that female bear abundance sharply declined when use of development increased during natural food failure. That was from our genetic work. It's commonly assumed that increases in conflicts are driven by an increase in the bear population. But if development is operating like an ecological trap, drawing bears into a place where they have reduced fitness, you could see increased conflicts despite a stable or even declining bear population. Our work really underscores the importance of understanding the demographic responses of bears to changing landscape conditions, especially to increased development, and really underscores the need to consider demographic viability of bears when promoting coexistence. This is the question we really grapple with a lot is it coexistence if bears and people share the same landscape, but bear populations are declining because of it? Is that coexistence? Okay, so what should managers do about it? Well, we found, they should invest in strategies that remove the attractants that really motivate the unwanted behavior. That effective management is going to require new strategies for working with municipalities because, Colorado Parks and Wildlife can't change trash law. So we're going to have to be really effective at working with cities and figuring out how we become successful at changing human behavior. And recognize too that data do not support some long-held assumptions. Like once a problem bear, always a problem bear. That didn't hold when we had data there. Is the Durango bear population increasing? Again, we don't see that. Okay, so how have our research results been used in management? Well, what was so cool is after we did the study, the city of Durango purchased and deployed an additional 1,500 self-blocking bear-resistant containers into our control areas. So we kind of have this perfect experiment that's continuing. So the control areas now have these self-blocking containers. That was technology that wasn't available in a certified can in 2011, but it was in 2018. So that's happening, and Stuart Breck is continuing research to look at how much more effective that is at reducing conflicts and increasing compliance. And now the state of Durango they're moving for all commercial and residential trash to be bear resistant. And our research has been used as justification in cities across Colorado to adopt stronger ordinances and require bear resistant containers. And so in the last couple of years, cities like Steamboat Springs, Manitou Springs, Colorado Springs, Bayfield, there's all these cities that are now citing the research as why they're now mandating bear-proof trash cans. So this has been super exciting. The research changed CPW's narrative on bear-human conflicts, altered management of bears within development in parts of the state, and helped stimulate a statewide conflict database. And what's also really fun is that the research has been reaching general audiences, besides managers, it's really reaching the general public. We had a guy, Dusty Hewlett, do a documentary on the film that's won awards at film festivals around the country, and the film is now playing on PBS affiliated television stations across the country. So I think they said it started in July, and I think they said in July, the first month, they think the film reached over 20 million households in the United States. And so, so, kind of this message of how do we coexist with wildlife? How do we coexist with carnivores? Is being reached to much wider audiences. And what's been interesting for me to see is that if a city council contacts you and you hand them a stack of papers on this issue, that we've published on the research, or if you show them Dusty's film, 1 hour film, like they'll adopt stronger ordinances and require bear proofing, not because of the papers, but because the movie. So I throw that out there because you can rent the film on Dusty's website, and if you have people that you want to show the film to that really talks about this issue of conflicts around human development, you want to show it to a city council or whatnot, contact Dusty about doing that. Okay, and then I just wanted to briefly list references for, all the results I talked about today came from, and then take questions. Yeah, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Yeah, something's going kooky with your microphone. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. So if you have questions, please type them into the chat there. We have a few, and I will read some of those. I just wanted to say again, without the noise, Heather, that was just a superb presentation. It was excellent. Okay. So the question is, how do these trash can models work? There has been an IBA manager discussion about testing models. Do you think that failure affected user acceptance? Can failure affected user acceptance?
Can failure? Maybe feel free to jump on if you just want to have a conversation about this. So maybe not totally following that. Basically, what we did was modeled the probability of conflict based on things like compliance and whatnot. We did environmental variables too, but those human variables were key. I mean, human behavior really drives it. Not so much if you live on an urban wildlife land interface or some of those kind of things we looked at, close to riparian area. Compliance. Do people in your neighborhood lock up their trash or not? I mean, that's the heavy hitter. What I think, was really cool is Stuart had a graduate student collecting data on the system now where they have these cans that are locking. They're locked all the time, except if you use your thumbs, to open the can and put your trash in. And you see a huge boost in compliance, as you'd expect. And so you take out a lot of this human error that, people just being so lazy that they can't clip the can, clip the lock. If you can take that all out, and now you give people a trash can where it's always locked, unless they unlock it, to put trash in, like all of a sudden, like, that's a game changer in terms of, this kind of human error or human failure piece. I'm not totally sure I answered your question, so feel free to help me understand it better if you want to type another question or speak up.
Yeah, this is Brian. I asked that question. I don't know if it's something that you actually had dated the model, so it might just be something you picked up from doing it. But my thought was just whether or not a lot of the cans, worked or survived the whole time, or if some of them just broke. There's been a lot of discussion about which model we should tell people to use. And I know Florida hasn't done a study as big as yours, and your studies covered a lot of ground. I thought the idea of tracking what the people do was great. We did a little pilot study, and some of our earlier cans, before they had the self-locking ones, the biggest problem we had with the cans being damaged was not the bears, but the trash guys. They would empty them and just throw them. I mean, I don't have data on that either. It's just something our local bear managers mentioned. But the people would complain not about the bears, but about the gorillas that were emptying the cans, breaking the lids and stuff. And I just wondered if this discussion we've had on the manager's corner about different models just give you an idea that some of the earlier models just didn't work as well, or they didn't work at all, or they broke too easy. Because that's something that we're making advances on. So if we make more advances in that alone, that could have big benefits too. But I wasn't sure how serious that was.
Yeah, so thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, yeah, I mean, obviously we use the old clip style, but some, for Durango, the ones that they put out, the self-locking cans and like the self-locking cans we use in Anchorage, I use in Anchorage, I mean, they work pretty well. Sometimes you have a lid that breaks, but often the company will, generally a small proportion of that happens, and the trash company can come out and replace the lid. Maybe it's different in a bigger city, but Durango, you know, it's a small place. The number of guys working on trash was, you know, it was a small group, and they didn't want to hurt the cans, right? Because they don't want to have to repair them, because they have the same ones collecting the trash are the same guys that are going to have to repair them. And so I feel like there people are really invested. So yeah, we didn't see that where the, you know, the people collecting the trash were doing damage to the containers. Yeah, no, we didn't see that at all. We did try a few models. People sent us models when we were trying to figure out what to buy initially, and in 2011 they just weren't ready. They did not work well. It wasn't going to work. But there's really good options now, I think, and at least with Stuart's analysis, he'll have data on at least one, maybe two models and how effective they are.
Hey, Heather, we've got another question here. How do you think individual bears in this population learned that it might be worth making long distance movements to human developments? Were they just making long distance movements until they found food resources? Or were they most often finding this in human developments?
Yeah, great question. So we call it adult female. So, you know, we wanted to call our females that were at least 3 years old or older. So I think a lot of the learning of where human food resources were happened before the collars on them. Generally, by the time we had a collar on them, occasionally we'd see some big exploratory movements, but pretty much for the most part, these bears just knew where to go. There was no exploratory. They truly just beelined. And a lot of bears, like we caught in 2012, that food failure in town, that then left town at the end of the season, and they never came back for the whole rest of the study. You know, 4 years later, they never came back to town. But they knew, you know, who knows how long it was since they had been there, you know, before. I mean, we had a lot of old, you know, 10, 15, 20-year-old bears in our study. So, I mean, who knows how long it's been since they've been, you know, used town before then. But I don't know. I mean, maybe they learn more as a sub-adult. I don't know. They're doing more exploration. I don't know, because we see some exploratory movements, but not a ton. Most of them, by the time we put a collar on them, man, they just knew where to go.
So here's another question. Knowing all this and community awareness, how can agency staff facilitate reduction in human conflicts? Would you agree that it is with those who control the garbage collection contracts by controlling the types of cans? Is it city councils, county commissioners, both?
Yeah, in Colorado, I don't know how maybe it works elsewhere, but in Colorado, it's definitely the powers with the city councils. The city council is the one that can mandate stronger ordinances and put teeth in ordinances, and they're the ones that can ultimately mandate that the city's going to do bear cans. And so if you want to go after, you know, to help people make this transition, I think you go after city council. And that's, I mean, it's at this local level that decides. And in some cases, Parks and Wildlife, you know, has been successful at giving presentations to city councils, you know, showing the data and whatnot, and getting, you know, pushing the issue. But more often, it seems to be community driven. It's citizen driven. The citizens are tired of what's happening, and and I have a lot of citizens contact me, and they want the papers, and they want, you know, they want the information because, it's more of like a citizen driven effort within city council. So, yeah, I guess I think that that's where to go with information. It's really, how you make the change, because a trash company, it's too expensive. A trash company is not going to want to do it. They're only going to do it if they have to, if they're forced to. We tried to get Waste Management, the big trash company in Colorado, on board at the very beginning. We thought we could partner with them. It'd be this great thing. We'll work with the trash company. No, that was completely unsuccessful. But now, man, there's pressure. All these cities in Colorado have said, this is all. You have to, if you're going to operate in the city, you have to provide trash containers at a reasonable price for people. And, now a big change happened.
Interesting. Here's another question. Was there bear hunting? Were habituated bears more vulnerable to hunting?
I don't think so, because a lot of them are in places that they can't be hunted very well during the season. A lot of times bears around development, they're just not vulnerable to harvest. They're not in places where people can hunt. There are areas to hunt right outside of town. But, generally, if bears are within development, they're protected from hunting, not from being vulnerable.
So just a comment is that I find it really fascinating that you've got really good data that shows that some bears that go into town during a food failure, they leave and they don't come back to town at all when the foods are doing good. We often think of bears that get food conditioned as being hopeless, and they're always going to go back because it's such an easy deal. But you didn't see that at all, did you?
No, I mean, there's always exceptions. So, there are definitely some exceptions, bears that pretty much stayed in development all the time. But generally, that was generally across the population. That's what we saw, that this kind of real switching behavior. And so now for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, they recognize if it's a bad food year, they're going to see a ton of bears in town that are good wild bears most of the time. And they recognize that now, especially with the bears that they put, that maybe the numbers they want to put down or whatnot, or what they want to do for management. They recognize there's a lot of bears that will come in just under these conditions that, otherwise are good wild harvestable bears for the state that they want to keep on the landscape. I think that's a really key point. And I think, just that once a problem bear, always a problem bear thing. I mean, what it's interesting in some parts of Colorado now, what they're doing is if they have bears that are in town in June, like when bears should not be in town, that they're removing those bears. So it's like, okay, that's a bear that's habituated. Early summer, there's no reason for them to be here. And if bears hanging out in town in June, like it's gone. But if a bear's coming in, hard food year, end of summer, we're gonna expect that, from now on. That's kind of how, change perception.
So here's a question. Did you experience a lot of recaptures when you were capturing bears? What do you think influences the recapture rate of individuals? Are habituated bears easier to capture, for example?
Way easier to capture. Habituated bears are way easier to capture. Yeah. We had Dusty in his film highlights C7, the seventh bear we caught in the film, and she's a habituated bear. And she lost her collar. She was really good. She got so big she could push the collar, right over her head, and she got her neck would just turn, like her neck would disappear. And so she was really good at slipping her collar. Man, we could always catch her. She was such a glutton. She'd always go into a trap. I was at a barbecue one night at a friend's house. She had slipped her collar the day before, and I watched her and her cubs come right by the barbecue, and I put a trap in that spot the next day, and I caught her again. We put the collar right back on her. So for sure.
The barbecue capture.
Yeah.
Okay. So that is our 1 hour time limit. We are finished with today's webinar. I want to thank Heather again for a superb presentation. Very well done, very clear, very interesting. And we will have another webinar next month, and you will receive notice about that. And this webinar will be posted to the YouTube site, and you will get a notice about where it's posted. So again, I thank everybody for being on here. We had about 30 plus people, and thank Heather for doing this, and thank her again for such a superb presentation. Thank you, Heather. And thank you to everybody who's been here, and we'll see you next month.